This season of Trucksafe Live is presented by LogRock. LogRock builds technology tools to help trucking companies stay compliant with federal and state regulations. LogRock is easier. We connect to multiple systems like your FMCSA account and ELD, so you only have to use one system. LogRock is faster. We automate tedious tasks so you can use your time more effectively. LogRock is smarter. We notify you of issues like expiring or missing documents before they happen, so you can be proactive rather than reactive. Setup is easy, and most of our customers are online shortly after signing up. Request a demo now at logrock.com.
All right, hey everyone, welcome to a special episode of Trucksafe Live, the show where we and our guests tackle the hot button issues impacting highway transportation. I'm Brandon, Trucksafe and Childress Law, excited to be here with you today. Like I said, a special episode talking about some breaking news that came from the FMCSA earlier this week regarding their SMS, Safety Measurement System, better known as CSA scores, and so wanted to spend some time breaking that down and kind of give folks my thoughts on it for what it's worth. Probably nothing, based on what I've read about these changes so far. Didn't have a whole lot of notice that this was going to be coming down the pike. We knew, every year the FMCSA comes out with its regulatory agenda, kind of what it's planning in the future, and this was not on it. We knew that they were contemplating some potential changes to their safety fitness determinations, their safety ratings, and we expect to see that sometime later this year in March or so, but didn't really have any notice that this was coming along. We knew over the last several years that FMCSA was directed by Congress to start to work on revisions to the SMS, but we just, at least I didn't have any heads up that this was happening. So it is what it is. We have it now. We have a notice from the FMCSA about its what it is proposing changing about that system, and so wanted to spend some time walking through that. There's a lot to it, and so we will just kind of walk through it. I don't have anything formally planned for this video today. So my plan is just to walk through the FMCSA's website that it has set up, talking about these changes, kind of walk through them step by step. There's 5 big changes, what I would consider to be fairly significant changes that we will walk through, and that will be how we go about this episode of Trucksafe Live. If you're here with us, say hey in the comments. We'd love to know who's here with us, and then as we go along, certainly would love to hear your thoughts on these potential changes and how they are likely to impact fleets, whether it's your fleet or some fleet that you would work with. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts. Before we do that, before we get to the topic of today, just a couple of things I want to mention. If you are not part of the Trucksafe Compliance Network, I would encourage you to join it. The TrucksafeNetwork.com is where you'll find more information. We also have an iPhone and an Android app that you can download for free on the App Store or the Google Play Store and get access to all of our DOT compliance content that we are regularly publishing, not only Trucksafe Live, the podcast, but also our in-depth DOT articles and all of our video content that we are publishing. But more than that, the network is meant as a space for safety professionals to gather together and learn from one another, ask questions, that type of thing. It's a forum for those folks to get together and learn about all of these important topics that help to keep our roadways safe. So, like I said, join the network if you're not already part of it. Yesterday we did a network exclusive webinar where we covered the top hours of service related pitfalls that are affecting fleets and how to get control of some of those issues and help minimize your exposure both to DOT regulatory enforcement, but more importantly to highway accident litigation. So those webinars are just a benefit of joining the network. Free to join, completely free to join, and all of that content is free. So check it out if you haven't already. The last thing I'll mention is our Fleet Compliance Boot Camp. This is really excited about this. It's coming up here. It'll be here sooner than later. It'll be April 19th through 20th. It's going to be in Indianapolis. We're going to try and do these twice a year. These are in-person conferences where we are going to spend 2 days diving deep into DOT regulations, DOT safety regulations, and how fleets can better manage their compliance programs and more effectively manage them and build out, cutting-edge safety programs. So that's what we're going to do. It's going to be a small group of us. We're limiting it to 25. We just opened up registration not too long ago. We're already halfway full. So if you're interested in joining us, check it out over at trucksafebootcamp.com. We would love to have you there with us. Like I said, we're going to try and do those twice a year. So this one is April 19th and 20th in Indianapolis, trucksafebootcamp.com if you are interested. All right, that wraps it up for the other things going on. Let's talk about the revisions to safety measurement system. That's why you're all here. Let's get into it. So we posted a pretty detailed article on the changes on our website. So if you want to read up on this after the discussion today, feel free to head over to trucksafe.com. You'll see it in our list of articles where we break it all down. Essentially, just some quick background here. What is it that we're talking about? So the safety measurement system, like I said, is sometimes better known as CSA, but CSA is actually the broader program that encompasses not only the safety measurement system, but also other enforcement tools that the FMCSA uses to prioritize motor carriers for enforcement, including things like safety ratings and roadside inspections and stuff like that. SMS is the scoring system within the broader CSA program, and it has been in effect in largely unchanged since CSA was first implemented in 2010. The FMCSA implemented it back then at the direction of the U.S. Congress as a way to better prioritize regulated motor carriers for enforcement. I've said this many times before. The reason we have this prioritization system in place is because the FMCSA is a fairly small agency, relatively speaking, even compared to other agencies that fall under the umbrella of the federal the United States DOT, and so it just doesn't have the reach that it needs to effectively keep tabs of the 700,000 plus motor carriers that fall under its jurisdiction. So it has to prioritize the most high-risk carriers for enforcement so that we can keep them off the roadways, and that way we can work our way down with the highest risk carriers first. And so SMS has become the primary way that the FMCSA does that. It is a scoring system. It brings in violation data for all regulated motor carriers, primarily from roadside inspections. So your trucks are out there, your drivers are out there. They get stopped for roadside inspection by FMCSA's state law enforcement partners. Violations you get written up for violations. All of those violations filter into the federal database, and that then lands on your SMS scores, your CSA scores. You are currently scored in 7 categories known as the basics. And we'll get into exactly how that's changing here soon, but that's kind of the system in a nutshell. It is scoring you in 7 categories. You're being scored against similarly situated motor carriers. What does that mean? It means that carriers that are incurring similar numbers of inspections with violations in each of those 7 categories, you're being scored against them. It's a 1 to 100 percentile scale. So that is the system that we're talking about, that SMS system. Like I said, it has remained largely unchanged for the past 10 years or so. There have been some minor changes here and there, but what we have seen over the years is a lot of criticism about the SMS system for a variety of reasons, a lot of legitimate reasons. I have complained about a lot of the problems over the years just as loud as anybody else. And so what that ended up doing is it resulted in the U.S. Congress stepping in back in 2015 or 16, somewhere around there. U.S. Congress steps in and directs the FMCSA to commission an independent study of the SMS platform, and then to implement whatever recommendations that independent body made about the SMS platform. And so we saw that happen in 2017. The National Academy of Sciences came in, did a comprehensive study of the safety measurement system, issued a detailed report about its findings and recommendations. And since that time, since 2017, we have kind of been in limbo. According to Congress, FMCSA is supposed to be implementing those recommendations, and it will ultimately be up to Congress whether it is satisfied with FMCSA's efforts to implement those recommendations. So that's where we're at. We've been waiting since 2017 for the FMCSA to implement the changes that the National Academy of Sciences had recommended. Now, importantly, and we mentioned this here in the article, the big finding from the National Academy of Sciences, and I think this is why we haven't seen anything sooner than we are now, is here was the finding from the National Academy of Sciences about SMS, that the system is structured in a reasonable way and its method of identifying motor carriers for alert status is defensible. I think the FMCSA took comfort in that. It was essentially kind of justifying their system despite the criticisms that we've had about the system over the years. Now, they went on to go ahead and make certain recommendations, namely that the FMCSA should consider moving to a different statistical model for the way that it handles violation data. So it had recommended, the National Academy of Sciences had recommended that the FMCSA consider what's called an item response theory, IRT model for purposes of handling the data. I won't lie and say that I know much about the IRT model. I've had experts of that model try and explain it to me numerous times, and I've sat through those discussions, and I don't feel like I can explain it to you all any better than I did before I had those discussions. It's a very complex model, but suffice it to say that was the NAS's recommendation to FMCSA. You should consider that model. It's a model that's used in other industries, as I understand it. A lot of standardized testing platforms use that model, and there are some other industries, so that's why they recommended it. All that's to say is this is the first takeaway from FMCSA's notice earlier this week, is that they are declining to adopt an IRT model, despite the National Academy of Sciences recommendation that they do so. They say in their notice that they tested an IRT model. They said they gathered together experts on that model. They tested it out, and here was their conclusion. You can see it here. As a result, FMCSA has concluded that IRT modeling does not perform well for the agency's use in identifying motor carriers for safety interventions and therefore does not improve overall safety. And so they are declining to move over to an IRT model, which essentially would have kind of completely revamped SMS as we know it. As I understand it, it would have not looked anything like it does currently had they adopted some kind of an IRT model, but apparently we don't have to worry about that because they are not adopting an IRT model. They went on to list their 5 main concerns about the model, and I'm not going to go through them all here, but essentially it's kind of what I just said. IRT modeling is not readily understandable by most stakeholders or the public. In other words, it's just confusing as hell. And so we're not going to use the IRT model. So that's what you need to know about that. We are not moving to an IRT model, according to FMCSA. So what are we doing instead? Well, we are, according to the agency, going to continue to improve the existing SMS system. So in other words, we are not going to get an entirely new system. We are just going to improve upon the existing system that we have. And that is where we come to the changes that they are proposing. Like I said earlier, from my perspective here, it's 5 main revisions to the existing SMS as we know it. So let's start to walk through those. I think the best way to do that is by looking at this new website that the FMCSA has set up. If you go to our article on this topic on our website at trucksafe.com, it has a link to the FMCSA's website. It's essentially a preview website of what the system, once these changes are implemented, is going to look like. And it does a pretty good job of getting in depth about these changes, and so that's what we're going to spend our time looking at today. As noted in the FMCSA docket, where they are putting all of the materials about these changes, they have very detailed documentation about this in the docket if you're interested in diving even deeper. We're not going to have time to get through all of it today, but just know that if you want to really dig into how the calculations are changing and the methodology that they're moving to, that documentation is available to you, including a list of all of the violations that we're going to be talking about today that are going to be changing a little bit in the new methodology. So that's all available there. But this is a look at the FMCSA's preview website for the changes that are in store for SMS. And I should take a step back and say when, or at least hit on when do we expect to see these changes? It's hard telling. We know that it's not going to be within the next few months because the FMCSA in its notice said that it is accepting comments from the public on these proposed changes. Up through May 15th, I think. And so we're not going to see this take effect at least until then. But then even after that comment period has expired, presumably the agency is going to do what it normally does in a traditional rulemaking, and it's going to review those comments and figure out whether it needs to make any revisions based on those comments. And then at some point after that is when we would see them roll out the changes. So if I had a crystal ball, which I don't, but I am not anticipating seeing any kind of changes to the existing SMS system probably for the next 5 or 6 months would be my guess, if not longer. But that's kind of what to expect, at least from my perspective. I will mention that this is not a traditional rulemaking. Normally, when an agency like the FMCSA, a federal agency, is thinking about making changes to its existing rules, it has to go through this notice and comment period where it publishes a notice of proposed rulemaking. It then opens that up to the public to weigh in with comments, and then they have a regulatory obligation or a legal obligation to then review those comments and then eventually publish a final rule. That's not the process that they're really following here. I haven't done an independent analysis to know whether they should be following that procedure, but the notice that they issued is not a notice of proposed rulemaking. It's not an NPRM as we're used to seeing when they propose new rules, like when they proposed the ELD rule. That was done through the traditional rulemaking process, an NPRM, etc. Here we just have a notice where the agency is saying, "Hey, we're making these changes," and presumably their rationale for doing it that way rather than formal rulemaking is that, hey, we are just responding to what Congress told us to do. We are not initiating these changes on our own accord, and so it doesn't have to go through the regulatory process to do that. I assume that's the rationale. I am not their lawyer, so who knows? Okay, so let's walk through what these significant changes will be if they end up looking like they are proposed right now. So here they are. If you navigate to the FMCSA's website, preview website, you'll see that they've got the main ones listed out here. They've got 9 of them. I think about 5 of them are the ones that are the most significant, and we'll start here with Reorganized Basics. So as I said earlier, under the current SMS methodology, we have 7 basics. These are the behavior analysis and safety improvement categories. First thing to know is that we are changing the name of that. We no longer have to remember what basics stands for. We're getting rid of basics, and we are moving to calling them just safety categories, which I think is a welcome change. I think we've got too many acronyms the way it is. So we're going to call these safety categories. Now, in terms of the actual categories themselves, like I said, we have 7 of them currently. What are the 7 currently? We've got unsafe driving, we've got driver fitness, hours of service, vehicle maintenance, crash indicator, drug and alcohol, and which one did I leave out? Or did I list 7? I don't know. I forgot. That's basically it. There may be one more that I missed there. But those are the 7 that we have currently. We are still going to have 7 even despite these changes, but what the 7 are is changing a little bit. And how are they changing? Well, first and foremost, that drug and alcohol basic that we have now is going away entirely. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Somebody says hazmat is the one I missed. Thanks for that. So those are the 7. The one that's going away is the drug and alcohol basic. And why is that going away? Here's why it's going away. Of all of the basics, drug and alcohol violations are the one with, at least according to the FMCSA, the least amount of violation activity that is in the system. Why is that? Because law enforcement is not discovering a ton of drug and alcohol violations while drivers are operating commercial motor vehicles. Those may be pretty common in a driver's personal vehicles, but it turns out they're not all that common when it comes to drivers operating commercial motor vehicles. So what that means practically is we just don't have a ton of violations that are popping up in that category. So what the FMCSA is proposing to do is to move that category, combine it with the unsafe driving category. So now it will be subsumed by the unsafe driving category. And why is that? Because the underlying conduct that we're concerned with in the drug and alcohol category to begin with is the unsafe operation that comes because of intoxicated drivers. And so we can put that in unsafe driving. It's an unsafe driving activity. So now those violations are just going to be shown in the unsafe driving category. So that's the first big change. So now that takes us down to 6 safety categories. Where's the 7th one if we're going to remain with 7? The new category is going to come about by splitting out the existing vehicle maintenance basic into 2 separate categories. We are taking that one basic and splitting it out into 2. You can see here on the FMCSA's website, they've got them listed here. We will be moving to 2 vehicle maintenance basics, safety categories, one called vehicle maintenance as it is today, and then one called vehicle maintenance driver observed. Why are we doing that? FMCSA says that the vehicle maintenance basic currently is the biggest basic of them all. It is the one that is capturing the most data. These are things like, brake violations, lighting violations, tire violations, everything that could go wrong with the commercial motor vehicle itself. Those violations are being filtered into the vehicle maintenance category, and it turns out that that's the biggest one. It's got the most data. And so what that means, according to the agency, is that it makes it difficult for motor carriers who have a lot of vehicle maintenance violations. A lot of motor carriers have a lot of vehicle maintenance violations to really get their arms around what is the problem, what are the systemic problems that are causing us to fail in that basic. And so FMCSA's hope, as I understand it, is to split these out, these different types of vehicle maintenance violations into 2 categories so we can get a better picture of exactly where things are going wrong from a vehicle maintenance standpoint. And so you could see that vehicle maintenance driver observed will be the new category. Essentially, that is going to be capturing vehicle maintenance violations that could have or should have been discovered by a commercial driver had he or she done a thorough pre- or post-trip inspection as the regulations require of them. As opposed to the other maintenance violations, which will continue to be just in the general vehicle maintenance category that could not have been discovered by the commercial driver in a pre-trip or post-trip inspection. In other words, they are more latent vehicle maintenance issues that are essentially not the driver's fault. That's what we're breaking this down into. We're breaking the vehicle maintenance category into, could this have been the driver's fault by not discovering it, or is it something that the driver couldn't have discovered despite him or her doing a thorough pre-trip inspection? That way, we know that if we are having a problem with the driver observed category, that the fix is probably to better educate our drivers and hold them accountable to conducting more thorough pre- and post-trip inspections. Whereas if we are having problems in the general maintenance category, then it says more about the mechanics of our truck rather than the driver behavior of not doing a thorough inspection. So that's it in a nutshell. We are breaking vehicle maintenance, the safety category, into 2, just general vehicle maintenance and then vehicle maintenance driver observed. The last thing I'll mention about The reorganization of the basics into these new safety categories is the moving of certain out-of-service violations. So currently, under the current SMS, if your driver essentially jumps an out-of-service order, which is to say that your truck or your driver has been placed out of service for a serious safety violation, yet that truck continues to operate despite that order being in place, or that driver continues to operate despite that out-of-service order being in place. That's called jumping an out-of-service order. Right now, there are several jumping and out-of-service order types of violations that are spread across the 7 different basics. So, for example, if you have a driver who is put out of service for an hours of service violation, and then he or she jumps that that order and continues to operate, flying in the face of that out of service order, that will now be written up as a separate violation, jumping an out of service order, but it will impact your hours of service basic because the out of service order was related to out of service or hours of service. Sorry. And so that's how it is under the current system. But what the FMCSA is saying with its changes is that really the underlying conduct that we're concerned with drivers jumping out of service orders is more of an unsafe driving concern. So what we're going to do is anytime there's been a jumped out of service order, that subsequent violation for jumping the order is now going to be put in the unsafe driving category rather than spread out across all of the other basics. So relatively minor change there, but that just means you're going to have more, potentially more violations in the unsafe driving category, whereas they would have previously been spread across all of your basics. But hopefully you're not having many drivers or trucks jumping their out of service order. That's bad news if you've got that going on. All right, so that's the first big change. Let's talk about the second one, which is a reorganization of roadside violations. This is a fairly significant change here. FMCSA, under the current safety measurement system methodology, there are 959 separate violation types that a driver could be written up for during a roadside inspection. 959 possible violations that they could incur during a roadside inspection, and those 959 violations are set out in the SMS methodology, and then they are tied to one of those 7 basics that we have currently. What the FMCSA is proposing is to reorganize those violations. We're still going to have all of them, 959. In fact, I think they're adding 14 more violations. So we're going to have 960 some, whatever the number happens to be, roadside violations where your drivers can still get cited for them roadside. But what we're going to do is we're going to consolidate them down into 116 violation groups. And what does that mean? It means that even though you may have multiple violations written up on a roadside inspection report, we're going to group violations that are similar to one another down into 116 violation groups. And so let's just read here what that means. While any of the 959 violations can still be cited during an inspection, for prioritization purposes, in other words, for scoring purposes under SMS, violations that identify the same or similar underlying safety issues would be grouped together. If a motor carrier receives more than one of the violations in a violation group during a single inspection, the new methodology would treat that set of violations as a single violation when calculating the carrier's measure in that safety category. They then go on to list this example, which is an hours of service compliance violation. If your driver is pulled over for a roadside inspection and they are in violation of several hours of service rules, 14-hour violation, 11-hour violation, 30-minute rest break, and a 70-hour violation, those will continue to be written up as 4 violations on the roadside inspection report. Under the current system, that would hit you 4 times in your hours of service basic. But under the proposed changes here, those would all be grouped together, or some of them would be grouped together as very similar types of violations, and therefore you would not be hit for them more than once when they are in the same group with one another, because the underlying conduct that we want to punish is the same for those similar violations. So it says here, if a motor carrier is cited for 2 or more of the violations above in the same inspection, these violations would all appear in the inspection report. However, when FMCSA analyzes the carrier's data to determine if the carrier should be prioritized, the new methodology would count this set of violations as one violation under the hours of service requirements violation group. I want to show you how this looks, because this is another part of the FMCSA's preview website. If you go there, you can actually see how the new system is going to look, and that's what we're looking at here. This is just a sample carrier that they give. You can actually, if you're a carrier, you can go put your own, you can log into your account and actually see how you would be performing under this new methodology if it ends up taking effect. I recommend you do that. You could see right now how you would be performing, and then compare that to how you're performing under current SMS. That'll give you a good feel for whether these changes are moving in the right direction or not. But here's the sample page for how the new SMS will look, and I wanted to show you, we're talking about these grouping of violations. Here's how it would look. If I were to log into a carrier's account and I go to the inspection history, you could see each inspection broken down into a row here. Normally, under the current system, you would then see a bunch of violations and how those are weighing on your scores from that inspection. But now you could see that they are being grouped into common types of violations, and then we'll talk about severity weights in a minute, but the big news here is that we are now grouping similar violations into one, so that you're not getting penalized when you've got multiple violations that essentially describe the same underlying conduct that we want to punish. Why is this important? I thought this was interesting of the FMCSA to note. Why are they changing this? Why are we moving to a grouping of violations for purposes of calculating your CSA scores? They say there are often multiple ways to cite a carrier for the same underlying safety issue. Their analysis of SMS indicated that for prioritization purposes, in other words, for scoring purposes, determining whether a safety issue is identified is more important than determining how many ways that it was documented. So ultimately, grouping is the way to account for this. We are more concerned that there is an issue, there is an hours of service issue, for example, than how many issues or how many times that manifested in a particular inspection. Hopefully that makes sense. But that's what we are doing with this proposed change, is we're going to be grouping violations. Let's see here. Let's see what comments we've got. We've got quite a few folks weighing in here. Dylan is saying, if the violation is not considered observable by a driver, would violations then be written differently at Roadside then directly to the carrier instead of issued to the driver and carrier simultaneously? He's going back to what we talked about a second ago, which is the vehicle maintenance driver observed category. I don't get that impression that we're going to be changing the way that these are written up Roadside. I anticipate that they will still be coded the same way that they are coded in a roadside inspection report. That report will still be directed to the motor carrier, and then through the SMS system is when I think that they will be split off into either vehicle maintenance or vehicle maintenance driver observed. That's kind of how we have the system now, where Roadside, the officers aren't figuring out what categories these violations belong in. They're just writing you up for the violation. And then on the back end, the SMS system is categorizing them into the right basic. I think that's how it will still work, even in the driver observed category. In other words, I don't think it's going to be a case where if it's a driver observed vehicle maintenance violation, that it only hurts the driver somehow. It is still going to impact the carrier. And I think that's the right way to do it, because even though it could have been observed by the driver, FMCSA has always taken the position that you as the motor carrier, it's still your responsibility to make sure that your drivers are following the law. We can't just try and push that off on the drivers themselves. We still have an obligation to make sure that we are training our drivers and holding them accountable to these rules. So I think that's how it'll work. Eric's saying, would a carrier vehicle maintenance violation still show on a PSP for the driver? I don't know about that. That's an interesting question. So a PSP, pre-employment screening program, is the program that lists out all of the violations and all of the crashes that a particular driver has incurred, and it's used by subsequent employers of that driver when that driver is applying to them. It's not mandatory, but a lot of motor carriers pull those PSP reports so that they could get a feel for what types of violations and crashes that driver has incurred. The question is, what about vehicle maintenance violations that are not driver observed that happen when a driver is driving that truck? In other words, this wasn't my fault if I'm the driver. This was something that was latent. I couldn't have discovered it even with a thorough pre-trip inspection. Is that violation, that vehicle maintenance violation, still going to show up on my PSP report? I don't think FMCSA has addressed that. I haven't gotten through all of their materials on these changes yet, but I don't think they've addressed it. It would make sense to me to not put that on their account. This kind of is the opposite, the other side of what Dylan was asking. Should the motor carrier's account still show driver observed violations? So should the motor carrier still be getting a slap on the wrist for the driver observed violations? Eric is asking, should the driver be slapped on the wrist for violations that should be attributed to the carrier? I suspect, if I had to guess, that these violations will continue to show up on both sides of the equation. They will both show up on the driver's PSP report, and they will certainly both show up on the motor carrier's CSA scores. That's how I envision it will work. Michael's saying the driver is the captain of the ship. I generally agree with that, though certainly there are certain situations where a driver is going to be written up for a violation that was completely outside his or her control. I don't think there's any denying that. I don't think that's what you're saying. But, yeah, so that's kind of the other side of that. All right, so that is the reorganized roadside violations is the second big takeaway from the FMCSA's proposed changes. Let's move on to the third. Again, I think there are 5 main changes that we're talking about here. The third main change proposed by the FMCSA are simplified severity weights. This is the one where I think the FMCSA comes the closest to actually addressing long-standing concerns about SMS. It has long been argued that a big problem with the SMS platform as it exists currently is the subjectivity of the severity weights that are assigned to all of the 900 plus violations that are in the system. If you're familiar with the system now, you know that every conceivable violation is listed out in the SMS methodology, and it is assigned a severity weight of between 1 and 10. More serious violations have a higher weight of 10 or whatever. More minor violations have a lower weight. And what that practically means is that if you incur a more serious violation, it's going to weigh heavier on your CSA scores, and it's going to be more likely that your scores are going to escalate, and then you're going to get prioritized for enforcement. The concern has been, who is setting these severity weights? Who's to say that a particular violation is more serious than another one? Especially when you jump across basics. For example, who's to say that an 11-hour driving violation is more serious than a tire tread depth issue on the vehicle maintenance side of things? So there was a lot of concern expressed about the subjectivity of these severity weights. They were essentially just set by FMCSA and people on its payroll. And so folks had problems with that. Who's to say that one violation is more serious than another? Well, the way that the FMCSA is now proposing to address that, by the way, that was a criticism that the National Academy of Sciences had about SMS, one of the main criticisms that they actually had in their report. And so FMCSA is now purporting to address that by simplifying severity weights. And what does that mean? Let's walk through it here. The new methodology would replace the 1 to 10 weighting scale for violations in SMS with a 2-value scale, a severity weight of either 1 or 2. Severity weights would be determined by the set of violations cited during an inspection within a violation group. If a motor carrier receives 1 or more violations within a violation group, that set of violations would be assigned a severity weight of 2 if any of the violations meet the following criteria. Number 1, it's out of service in any category except unsafe driving. Or number 2, it's a driver disqualifying violation. So what that means essentially is that, well, here, let's just keep going here and then we'll break it down. If none of the violations in a set are out of service or driver disqualifying violations, then that set will receive a weight of 1. Why is this important? After conducting analysis on multiple approaches, FMCSA determined that assigning a customized weight to all violations was not as important as noting that the violation actually occurred. This simplified approach identifies carriers with higher crash rates for prioritization and makes it clearer why a specific violation is weighted more heavily than others. I think we could break this down by looking back at this sample motor carriers report here and looking at how the weighting is displayed. If you log into your SMS account now, you will see a similar calculation, but you will see when it comes to severity weights, you will see that each violation has a severity weight of between 1 and 10. The ones with a higher violation or severity weight are impacting your scores more heavily. Going forward, we're only going to have 2 severity weights, either a 1 or 2. We're still going to have a time weight, which we have currently, so more current violations are going to carry a greater weight than older violations. But the severity weights are much more simple. They are either 1 or 2, and most of them are going to be 1. And so if, again, and this goes back to the grouping, if you have multiple violations written up on a roadside inspection report, and some of those violations turn out to be in the same grouping, the 116 new violation groups, then you're only going to get potentially 1 point for that, even though there may be multiple violations in that particular group. So in other words, how it would work normally is you would have a separate severity weight for all of those violations. So if you have 3 hours of service violations that are essentially describing the same conduct, then you could potentially have a severity weight of 30, 10 for each of them. I think it maxes out at 30 now under the current methodology. But now we're talking about something entirely different. If you've got a bunch of violations, some of them are grouped together, then you potentially have just a severity of weight of 1 for that entire group. The instances where you will have a severity weight of 2 are those 2 instances that are listed out here. Either there's an out-of-service violation in one of those groups, which are the more serious violations where your truck is actually put out of service roadside or your driver is put out of service roadside because of the seriousness of that violation. If there's an out-of-service violation in one of those groups, then the severity weight will be changed to, like we see here, this is an operating while out-of-service violation. It has a severity weight of 2 because that is an out-of-service violation. So if there's an out-of-service violation in any one of the groups, that group is going to have a severity weight of 2. If there's no out-of-service violation in that group, then your severity weight is going to be 1 unless that group also contains a violation that is a driver disqualifying violation. What's that mean? The regulations have a list, and the citation is listed here, of certain types of violations that will render a driver disqualified to operate a commercial motor vehicle because of the seriousness of the violation. These are you could pull up this list if you're interested in what they are, but the one that always comes to my mind when I'm thinking of those is instances where a driver is using a handheld device while operating a commercial motor vehicle. That is a disqualifying offense. Now, the way that the disqualifying offenses work currently is that it usually takes a conviction of that offense and sometimes multiple convictions of that offense for the driver to actually be deemed disqualified. So in other words, if a driver gets tagged for operating a commercial motor vehicle with a handheld device once, that's not going to disqualify him from operating a commercial motor vehicle. He actually has to be convicted of that by a court, and then I think that's one of the ones where he actually has to be convicted more than once for that same violation for the disqualification to kick into effect. I don't know how that's handled here. I haven't dug that deep into this yet. I don't know if this is saying that in order for this to carry a severity weight of 2, the driver has to have been convicted of these disqualifying violations according to this regulation? I suspect that's not how it works. I suspect rather that the way that this works is if a driver is cited on a roadside inspection report for any of these disqualifying violations that are listed in 383.51, regardless if he ultimately gets disqualified because of those, it's still going to carry a severity weight of 2. I suspect that's how it works. So those two instances, if there's a violation of those varieties that appear in one of your inspection reports, then that violation group will have a severity weight of 2. All other ones will have a severity weight of 1, and then they will be multiplied by the time weight, and that will give you the total weight for that particular inspection. That's how it will work under the proposed changes, a much simplified version of severity weights. So at least in that regard, it seems like FMCSA is pushing SMS in the right direction based on the criticisms it has received in this regard specifically. All right, so that is the third big change. We've got a couple of more here. Let's see if we've got any more comments. Someone's saying, what I find concerning is the raised thresholds for each basic. We'll get to that in a second. Okay, so let's move on here. The fourth, we got one more here. Driver disqualification offense. A list is on the new prioritization review spreadsheet. Yes, if you go to this website, the one that we're talking about here, the one that we're looking at here, they've got a lot of good resources, including a list of all of the violations and where they will appear in the revisions, and also of the driver disqualification offenses. So check that out if you want to see the details. All right, so let's move on then to the fourth significant change about SMS, proposed change, and that has to do with improved intervention thresholds. This is the one that was just mentioned by someone watching. You will know under the current system that in each of the 7 basics, there is what's called an intervention threshold, sometimes called an alert threshold. It is a percentile score that has been set by the FMCSA in each of the basics, where if you are a carrier and your score exceeds that intervention threshold on a particular month, you're going to get a nice big warning triangle on that basic on your SMS account. And what that means is you're prioritized for enforcement. You're doing not so great in that particular basic, and that's a hint to FMCSA and to its law enforcement partners that there may be a problem here. Where there is smoke, there may be fire, and so that moves you up on the prioritization list for a potential audit, for example. In my experience, usually having one basic in alert status rarely leads to anything more than just a warning letter. It usually takes a couple of basics being above the intervention thresholds before you'll actually get a knock at the door for an audit. That's been my experience. That's not to say that's always the case. If you have even one basic in alert status, then you could theoretically see further enforcement, but that's been my experience historically. So those intervention thresholds have been set. There's a different intervention threshold for each of the basics, and then there are different intervention thresholds based on what type of motor carrier you are, whether you are a general commodity carrier, a hazmat carrier, or a passenger carrier. So there's essentially 3 thresholds based on your carrier type within each of the basics, and that's how it is currently. We're changing these up a little bit, but not a ton with these proposals here. What are we doing? Well, first of all, we should know that the current intervention thresholds for, I want to get this right here. Current intervention thresholds for unsafe driving, crash indicator, and the hours of service safety categories, those basics, are not going to be changing. They are going to be remaining the same. What is changing is we are changing the thresholds for certain types of categories in the driver fitness category and the hazmat compliance category. And by the way, we're also grafting on the existing intervention thresholds from the vehicle maintenance category to the new vehicle maintenance driver observed category. So it will take on the same thresholds as the current vehicle maintenance category. The ones that are changing are the driver fitness and the hazmat compliance basics. How are they changing? You can see it here. For the driver fitness category, for general commodity carriers, the current threshold is 80%. It will be moving to 90%. For passenger carriers, it is currently 65% in driver fitness. It will be moving to 75%. And for hazmat carriers, it is currently 75%. It is going to 85%. What does that mean? Well, like I said earlier, their intervention threshold is essentially targeting the highest risk carriers in all of those categories. These are percentiles. So right now, the intervention threshold for general commodity carriers is set at 80% in the driver fitness category. That means that we are going to target the worst performing 20% carriers in their safety event groups in the driver fitness category for potential enforcement. So the worst performing 20% of carriers in the driver fitness category will have that warning triangle on their driver fitness category. That's how it is currently. What we are saying with these changes is we're moving that up to 90%. So now going forward, we're only going to be concerned about the worst performing 10% of carriers in that category rather than the worst performing 20%. So essentially, I kind of look at it as FMCSA is tightening its focus in these particular categories specifically, driver fitness and hazardous materials compliance. It is only going to be escalating a smaller group of carriers in those categories who are having problems in those categories. This is essentially what it comes down to. Let's see how FMCSA justifies this here. Why is this important? FMCSA's analysis showed that every safety category has a different relationship to crash rate, with some having a higher correlation than others. So essentially, it's taking the two basics where it turned out that there wasn't a great correlation between poor performance in those categories and crash risk, and it is tightening its focus there. In fact, I think there was some data out there to suggest that the driver fitness category had an inverse correlation to crash risk. Carriers that had a higher driver fitness score were less likely to be involved in a crash, which was just crazy. But they are recognizing that fact here, and they are raising the thresholds in these particular categories because they turn out to be the categories that have less correlation to future crash risk. Adjusting the thresholds ensures the FMCSA focuses its enforcement program on the carriers with the highest crash rates. So that's its justification. All right. Someone's asking, when will these changes take effect? Yeah, I said earlier, you may not have been on then, but we don't know precisely when they're taking effect yet. We're in a comment period now. The FMCSA is soliciting comments from the public at least until the middle of May. They are opening up their docket to receive comments. So if you have comments about these, make sure you go in there and file them. That's how you get your voice heard about if you've got problems with these changes. And I expect the FMCSA will be receiving a lot of comments in connection with this notice. But suffice it to say, we don't know yet when these changes are going to take effect and if this is going to be how these changes look ultimately. What we have to do is wait to see how the FMCSA addresses those comments. And like I said earlier, if I had to guess, I would say we're probably not going to see these changes take effect at least for 6 months, if not more. So. All right, let's wrap up here with a couple of the last significant changes here. This one is arguably the most significant change, and it has to do with those percentile scores and making them proportionate. This has to do with the way that we currently try and group motor carriers together in the current SMS. I mentioned early on that motor carriers in each of the basics are split out into what are called safety event groups. The purpose of these safety event groups is because it would be fundamentally unfair for us to try and rank motor carriers, one motor carrier on the one hand that has very little inspection data in a particular basic with a carrier that has thousands of inspections with violations in that category. It would be unfair to try and rank those two carriers. It's just not apples to apples, is the point. And so we fix that, or we purportedly fix that under the current system by breaking motor carriers out into safety event groups and then ranking them only within their safety event groups so that carriers with similar characteristics are ranked against one another rather than carriers that are apples to oranges. But the problem that was causing, and this was another big criticism of the current SMS system, is that what it meant is that a carrier that happens to change safety event groups, for example, if they're teetering right on the edge of one safety event group and the next one up, and then they get one more additional inspection with a violation in that category, now they're thrown into that higher safety event group. Now they're being compared against a much different subset of motor carriers. What was happening practically was that when they jumped up to the next safety event group, you would see huge swings, potentially huge swings in their CSA score in that basic because of the fact that they simply jumped up to a different group. And that wasn't really fair, because the fact that they got one additional inspection with a violation they shouldn't be penalized for that. It's not saying a whole lot about, in other words, that one extra violation is not saying that now they are a terrible carrier. All that's saying is now they're in a different safety event group, so we shouldn't over penalize them for that. Well, the system as it is currently does that. It over penalizes for that type of thing. And so what the FMCSA is doing is moving to a different type of a way of handling safety event groups. I'm just going to read it here. This is probably the most complex change that the FMCSA is proposing. And there's detailed information about this on the FMCSA's website, preview website, and in their more in-depth methodology document if you're interested in the actual calculation of this. I'll pull it up so we can at least see it, but it's pretty complex. Here's what they say. Proportionate percentiles use the exact number of inspections and crashes to assign a percentile for a motor carrier rather than relying on the cutoffs in SMS established by safety event groups. This methodology has several benefits compared to safety event groups, which are used currently, including they are customized to a carrier's exact number of events. It ensures stable results for carriers by only allowing for gradual percentile changes from month to month when dropping or adding events, and it allows an individual carrier's change in measure to have greater influence on their percentile. There will no longer be substantial percentile increases without a corresponding measure increase. That's the big takeaway with this change, is that we're trying to temper those big swings that we would see when a carrier moved between event groups based on just one additional or one less inspection with a violation, for example. Why is this important? FMCSA says it's important because this approach would improve the agency's ability to compare carriers with similar carriers and more precisely and accurately indicate how a carrier's performance is trending from month to month. And so I said I would show kind of the calculation. Here it is. I'm still wrapping my mind around this. It's not all that intuitive, but if you're interested, this chart here is on our article on this on our website at trucksafe.com. Essentially, they're going to be. I'm not even going to try and explain it. You'll just have to look at that for yourself. It's pretty complex. But just know that the point of that change is to try and eliminate or at least temper those big swings that would come when a carrier just move between safety event groups without anything significant happening with regards to its violations in that particular category. All right, and we are running out of time here, so I want to hit on what I consider the last most significant change that the FMCSA is proposing with SMS, and that has to do with a greater focus on, or did I skip one here? Nope, we hit all those. Okay, so this is the sixth one. I guess I would consider six of them to be fairly significant. And this is a greater focus on recent violations. So you may know that under the current SMS methodology, the system has violation data in the system going back 24 months. So all of your violation data from the last 24 months is impacting your scores currently. It's still going to be that way even with the changes. We're still going to have 24 months worth of violation data in the system, but we are going to focus more heavily on violations that have occurred in the last year. We do that currently through time weights, but what are we talking about changing here? Here's how FMCSA describes it. The new methodology would only calculate percentiles in a safety category if the motor carrier has received at least one roadside violation in that category within the last 12 months. This means that a carrier with violations in a safety category that are all 12 months or older will not be assigned a percentile and would not be prioritized in that category based on roadside inspection data alone. The proposed change applies to these safety categories. It's hours of service, vehicle maintenance driver observed, hazmat, and driver fitness. So what does that mean? Well, that means that if you have violation data in the system in one of these basics that are listed here, one of these safety categories, but all of your violation data is older than a year, in other words, if you've improved things, you have fixed the problems that you were previously plagued with, and you haven't incurred any violations in the last 12 months, then you're not going to have a percentile score at all in that basic. You will just have no score. Whereas if you have a violation in that category within the last 12 months, then you very well could have a score, depending on some data sufficiency protections that are built into the system. So we are putting a greater emphasis on activity within the last year. We are rewarding you if you have taken steps to fix those problems, and you essentially have clean inspections, no violations within those categories over the last 12 months. We're not even going to give you a percentile score. So there's no risk of you being prioritized based on your activity, your prior activity in that particular basic. All right. That wraps up what I consider to be the most significant portions of the FMCSA's proposed changes to SMS. I have a lot of folks asking for my opinion on this. My opinion on this is, so far what I have read, I'm okay with. I think it is moving SMS in the right direction based on the criticisms that we have had about the program over the years. At least on paper, it looks like the FMCSA is taking those concerns into consideration, and it is working to fix them. It's yet to be seen whether it actually fixes them, right? Because we won't really know until carriers start to put their data or log into the system and see how this actually impacts their scores. And so I'm going to reserve judgment on this until we start to really dig in and see how this will actually, in the real world, impact motor carriers. But I think generally speaking, it's moving in the right direction. The other thing I have said is that I fear the next step of this. And what I mean by that is I worry, as I start to dig into this, that FMCSA is setting the stage for even more drastic changes that I would not be a fan of. Those drastic changes they haven't proposed this, so don't go out and say that this is going to happen. But this is what I fear is going to happen. I fear that FMCSA is going to take the position that SMS with these changes is fixed, and that therefore, going forward, they can try and tie a motor carrier's safety rating to their scores. This is something that the agency tried to do probably 5, 6, 7 years ago. They actually came out with a proposed rule where they were going to tie your safety rating to your SMS scores. And that got a lot of a bad press, and it got a lot of negative criticism, and ultimately Congress stepped in and said, no. You, FMCSA, are not going to be doing that until you fix the problems with SMS. And so they withdrew that former rulemaking, and we haven't heard anything about it since. They haven't said anything about it since, and they don't say anything about it in this notice, but I fear that this notice is setting the stage for them to then take it that next step and once again try and tie a motor carrier's safety rating to these scores. Somebody's asking, will they change safety rating to fit, unfit, rather than the 3-tier system that we have now, which is satisfactory, conditional, or unsatisfactory. That was the agency's proposal 6 or 7 years ago, was to move away from the 3-tier system into a binary system of either fit or unfit, depending on your CSA scores. So it very well could be. We know FMCSA in its regulatory agenda, as I said earlier, they noted that they are contemplating changes to the safety rating process, also known as the safety fitness determination process. We just don't know what that looks like. But putting the puzzle pieces together here, I suspect what that means is they feel comfortable with these changes to SMS that they can then tie a motor carrier's a safety rating to these scores in some form or fashion. Why does that scare me? It scares me because I anticipate that will result in a lot of motor carriers being shut down based solely on roadside inspection data, which for a variety of reasons gives me a lot of heartburn. And here's a big reason why it gives me heartburn. One of my major criticisms, and I know a lot of folks share this concern with me, with the way that we handle SMS now and violations that impact a motor carrier scores, is the lack of due process available to motor carriers to challenge erroneous violations that get written up roadside. Law enforcement is not infallible when it comes to writing up these violations. They make mistakes. They are only human. You would hope that there is a system in place that would afford motor carriers and drivers in those situations with due process to challenge those erroneous violations and get them removed from their account. The system that we have in place is the data queue system. That is the only system that's available to them to challenge erroneous violations. That program suffers from a lot of problems in my opinion. Namely, the people reviewing your appeals that you submit through the data queue system are the very same agencies that wrote the violation in the first place. It is not an independent, a disinterested third party, or even the FMCSA that's reviewing your data queues appeals. If the Indiana State Police wrote you up for that speeding violation and you have some reason to challenge it, it's the Indiana State Police that is serving as the jury, the judge and the jury on your appeal through the data queue system. They are inherently biased, in my opinion. And so what we see through the data queue system, at least in my experience, is a fairly low success rate on those appeals. And I think, for what it's worth, again, probably not much, but this would be my big concern if we move to that next step of trying to tie a motor carrier's safety ratings to this new and improved SMS, is that we should not be doing that until we give motor carriers a more robust system and a more independent, a more unbiased system to challenge erroneous data that inevitably gets uploaded to the system. Officers making mistakes. Happens every day. I filed probably a dozen data queue challenges every week for my motor carrier clients. And in my estimation, motor carriers have a right to be challenging those violations because they are wrong in the cases that I review. I don't think it's right for motor carriers just to challenge all violations. They need to have a good faith basis for doing it. That's always my recommendation. So when I'm filing these data queue appeals on behalf of my clients, it's because I believe we have a good factual or legal basis to say that the officer got it wrong. And what I'm finding is that despite our best evidence and our best attempts to get those removed, those officers are disinclined to grant those requests, and those violations stand. And those violations, in my view, are wrong. They should not be impacting that motor carrier score. So what I'm saying is that if we're going to move to a system where we are tying the carrier's lifeblood, its safety rating, its ability to do business to the SMS system, we better be sure that we have a robust due process system in place for them to challenge and get the erroneous violations removed from their account. Otherwise, we're going to be unjustly shutting down motor carriers based on potentially erroneous data. So that's just my 2 cents on it. We'll see if that's where we end up. Like I said, we are expecting to hear what the FMCSA has in mind in terms of changes to the safety rating process in March. At least that's what was listed in their regulatory agenda. So enough rambling from me. Appreciate everyone joining me today for this special episode of Trucksafe Live. We do these Trucksafe Live episodes. We try and do them monthly. A lot of times we have guests on here, so it's not just me rambling on and on. We like to have guests to come on and give us their insight on hot button issues impacting highway transportation. So tune in if you're interested. You can find more about our future shows on trucksafelive.com. Follow us on social media. We're pretty active on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and we talk pretty much exclusively about matters concerning DOT compliance and running a regulated fleet. So follow us there. Subscribe to our newsletter, trucksafe.com, if you're interested in getting the latest highway transportation news and analysis delivered right to your inbox. And that's all I've got. Appreciate you joining me today. Reach out if you have any questions about this particular topic or want help drafting comments or understanding how this is likely to impact your fleet, I'm always happy to discuss those issues. Thanks, everyone. See you later.